Okay, let's pick back up now and look at 2 Samuel. And we've talked about in other classes that in the original Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, there isn't a 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. They're one book. And the reason why at some point they began to be split up and then later on they're called 1st and 2nd Samuel is because at a certain point it's difficult to manage a scroll if it's got too much on it. And so they would split them up. But then the Hebrews still thought of it as one book, and we ended up later on putting it down as 2 books and calling it 1st and 2nd. Same thing is true with Ezra and Nehemiah, is one book in the Hebrew Bible, and the 12 minor prophets are all one book. They're called the Book of the 12. So just more fun facts. 2 Samuel. This, again, as with 1 Samuel, traditionally is written by the prophet and priest Samuel. The date is 930 BC and later. And this picks up the story of David. 2 Samuel is the story of David. Of course, he was identified and anointed in 1 Samuel. Now we get the reign of King David and the growth of Israel under his leadership. So, David is the most popular king in Jewish history. He also is probably one of the 3 most important figures in Jewish history, those 3 being Abraham, Moses, and David. Abraham being the father of the Jewish people, Moses being the lawgiver, the one who gave them the religion, and David being the great king, the political leader. So those 3 together are the 3 most important characters in Jewish history. The book is 2 Samuel, in fact, all the accounts about David are amazing for their honesty. They admit faults. Remember what I told you before is that history originally, and history as we know it, didn't begin until 500 years after this, because this is almost 500 years before Herodotus. But typically what they would do is when they wrote the annals or chronicles, it would always make the king look good. You know, the king, you never said anything bad about the king. Well, that's not true here. One of the things that gives the ring of truth and authenticity to Scripture is that this is completely honest about, as the rest of Scripture is with people like Peter in the New Testament, for instance, about his successes, his failures, his sin, his repentance, all the good, all the bad, it's all in there. That was completely unknown at this time in this period in history for any other culture or any other writings. Nothing else would have been so quick to tell of the mistakes and failures of somebody like David. And the fact that his son from Bathsheba died as a judgment against his sin with her. The fact that he not only committed adultery with her, but then had her husband killed. To tell all of that is quite astonishing. And so you can think of this book as being in 3 sections. The triumphs of David, his coming into power, his winning victory, expanding the kingdom. Then the transgression of David, which is the transgression of Bathsheba. He saw her bathing on the rooftop from one Mirador to another. He could see her bathing and then desired her and committed adultery with her and then had her husband Uriah the Hittite killed in order he tried first to cover it up by having Uriah brought home because Bathsheba was pregnant, thinking people would think that it was his baby. Well, then Uriah was so faithful, he said, I will not go to the comforts and pleasures of my home when my brothers who are still out on the battlefield don't have that advantage. And so they ended up putting him in a position in the war that he ended up dying. And then the troubles of David. There was judgment about that, about his own family, his own sons. One particular rebelling against him and chasing him out of Jerusalem and completely rebelling, taking his wives as concubines, all sorts of horrible stuff. And then later on, David, of course, regained power and control, and his son Solomon ended up being the heir. But all of this is a very honest account of the great king of the Jews, which is David. All right? Questions about any of that? We'll look at a couple of verses. Yes?
I've always been troubled about, the sins of the father will be, down to
visited on children, yeah.
I mean, what does that, I mean, is that actual, factual stated as it is, or is it meant as it is?
It doesn't say children will be condemned because of the sins of their father. When it says that the sins of the fathers will be visited on the children, think of what that means. Like when the people of Judea were unfaithful to God, and after warning after warning after warning, he finally sent the Babylonians to destroy their city and to take them to captivity. And they were in captivity for a couple of generations. Who suffered for that? The children. You know, the sins of the fathers create situations that I don't think it's that God says, okay, your father sins, so I'm going to smite you. But when we sin, we create situations that that not only we, but our children, our families, our friends, our neighbors could suffer from. And I think that's what that means, is the sins of the fathers lead to circumstances that make it very difficult on their children.
Okay, isn't there the part where they asked Jesus, was that the sin of the
Right.
blind man?
Yes.
Yeah, and he said,
Yeah.
didn't follow.
Is it this man who sinned, or was it his parents? And Jesus said neither one, but rather that the glory of God could be shown forth in him. So I think that that's what it means, is that when we create a situation that causes grief to everybody involved, you know, God may forgive us of our sin, but we still have to deal with the consequences of it. And that's not just the consequences on us, but on our children and on others. Make sense?
It does.
Okay, let's look at 2 Samuel chapter 7 and verses 8 and then 11 to 16. Now then tell my servant David, this is what the Lord Almighty says. I took you from the pasture, from tending the flock, and appointed you ruler over my people Israel. The Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you when your days are over and you rest with your ancestors. I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, who will come from your own body, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. When he does wrong, I will punish him with a rod wielded by human beings, with floggings inflicted by human hands. But my love will never be taken from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed from before you. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. Okay, this is talking about the fact that David has God's blessing, and God promises to David that his son, Solomon, will become king. And that if Solomon messes up, unlike what he did to Saul, and that is remove his blessing from Saul, God will continue to bless Solomon for his lifetime. And that any punishment he receives will not be a divine punishment, but rather a human punishment. He'll have to deal with the earthly consequences of his own actions. Okay? So this is the promise, and this is why Solomon, who had 700 wives and multiple concubines, who married foreign peoples, foreign wives who he wasn't supposed to do. He gathered a large stable of horses, which he wasn't supposed to do. You know, they don't talk about that much, but God specifically said, "Do not get in the horse business." And yet Solomon had huge stables, and a horse was a sign of war. It meant that he was always ready to go to war. And Solomon actually not only allowed, but encouraged, apparently, his wives in their foreign worship. You know, he created for his wives places where they could do human sacrifice. And God had promised here he would not remove Solomon. And so Solomon remained in power through his life. But when he died, the kingdom split between his son, Rehoboam, and the one who challenged him, Jeroboam. And the kingdom got split in two, which we'll talk about. Okay? We'll get to that in a minute when we get into Kings. But this was the promise that God made to David. That I will bless you and I will bless your son as king.
At what point was that? Was this after he lost the son?
No, this was before. This is before.
Right at the very beginning.
Well, yeah, this is chapter 7, and he didn't have the experience with Bathsheba until chapter 11, and it wasn't from chapter 12 on that he has the consequences of his sin, destroying his family, and etc. So this was before all of that. Okay, this is what the kingdoms of David, Solomon, and Saul looked like. I should probably put it in a different sense. The green was the extent of Saul's kingdom. right? Jerusalem as the capital, and it's up to Dan to part of Moab. So that's all that Saul controlled. When David took over, significant enlargement. He controlled all of this. Everything pretty much except the cities of Philistia, where the Philistines were. Ashdod, Joppa, and Gaza. And then the cities of Phoenicia up here. But then everything else up into, here's the Euphrates, by the way. We were talking about that. Okay. And then the Tigris would be over here. So then, when Solomon comes on board, he doesn't actually conquer more than David had. He retains it all, but he gains economic control over this. What that means is, frequently, kings, there's only so much land you can actually control, but under threat of conquest, they often would have what they would call client nations. A client nation is a nation that you say, look, we'll let you run your own business. You can be, we're not going to conquer you as long as you pay us. You're a client nation. So in effect, they were paying taxes to them, but then they were allowed to run their own affairs. And so that's what economic control means up here in this area.
Is that in Assyria?
Well, yeah, Syria would be here. So yes, there wasn't Assyria at that time.
No.
But and Haran, of course, is where which was down here, was the Chaldees is where Abraham came from. And he went up to Haran. That's where his father died. And then from Haran, he came down into the promise. What would be the promised land? Yes.
How big would it be today, where the Israel part is?
Well, I can show you later. It comes down, it's much narrower down here. There's less of this, the Sinai Peninsula. This is the Sinai Peninsula. This is the Gulf of Aqaba. This is the Red Sea over here. So there's a very thin kind of point down here where Ezion Geber, which today is the city of Aqaba. And Aqaba is Jordanian, but right next to it is the Israeli city, and they all come to a point right at the north end of the Gulf of Aqaba. And so there's a very thin, and it goes up, doesn't include Damascus, that's Syria, all of this is Syria. So it would go up as far as Dan and then back around. These are the Golan Heights, right in here. This is the West Bank area, the West Bank of the, and then the Gaza Strip is here, that's Gaza. It used to be controlled by Egypt. So that's what it would look like today. And during the time of David and Solomon, especially Solomon, Israel was a very wealthy land. People came from all over to pay homage to the kings of Israel. There were no major powers that were really challenging them at that point. There was sort of a brief period after the Akkadians, the Hittites, the Assyrians, and the Babylonians. After the major power of Egypt, now Egypt rose again later, and we end up having a conflict between some of those powers because a number of them had their first kingdoms, and then they had a neo-Babylonian, neo-Assyrian, neo-Egyptian. Egypt never went away, but it just was sort of quieted and then later came back in force. When we get into the times of destruction later on, under the prophets, that's when the neo-Assyrian and neo-Babylonian came up, right?
Isn't this when Queen of Sheba came to visit him too?
Correct. Queen of Sheba, and there's some disagreement as to where the Queen of Sheba came from. We visited Oman several times, and Oman claims that Oman is the country right on the south end of the Saudi Arabian peninsula. In Yemen, okay, so you got Saudi Arabia, and Yemen is right here, and then Oman is here. Oman claims that Queen of Sheba was from Oman, the south end of Saudi Arabian peninsula. The more traditional view is that she was Ethiopian. When you've got Saudi Arabia, Yemen, and then right across the sea here, or the Red Sea there, is where Ethiopia is. The tradition that she was from Ethiopia, and she came and visited, and she took the Jewish religion back with her, which is why we've had Ethiopian Jews even before the diaspora, even before the lost tribes under Assyria. There has been a Jewish presence there. The Ethiopian eunuch who was studying the Jewish scripture, and Philip sees him, it would have been fairly common for them to have the Jewish scripture because of the Queen of Sheba having visited. And then the tradition is that when Queen of Sheba went back, she took more than just the religion. She also took back a son, and she was pregnant when she left Solomon. And that son became Menelik, which is one of the great early rulers of Egypt and of Ethiopia. And that area of Ethiopia and part of Sudan, that whole region, was a major kingdom at one point, the kingdom of Axum. And we Westerners, there's a whole lot of kingdoms like that we don't even know about. The kingdom of Axum was quite significant in terms of trade, and it was, well, it was a big deal. So if you go to Ethiopia today, you can visit some of the sites that were built by some of the kings of Axum, like Lalibela, which is, Lalibela was the name of one of the kings. And it was the name of a place now, and there are all these extraordinary stone churches. Because the Jewish faith was there, but they also had the Ethiopian Orthodox faith, and that's one of the oldest Christian faiths. And you're walking along these looks stone level, and you're walking along, and all of a sudden you come and you look down. They have carved these stone churches below ground. So it's like, they have this flat, massive amount of rock, and then they, by hand, chipped out, and then stairs go down, and then you can go into the churches and stuff. It's Orthodox churches, and they're very restricted. We were able to actually go inside, one or two of them because we had connections when I was at the World Vision. But yeah, it's astonishing stuff, and that was all because of the fact that at one time that was a really significant civilization, which we don't think about.
Is it there they said they have the ark?
Yes, and again, there's a relationship there as well. When the Ark of the Covenant was lost, there's a pretty strong argument that it has been in Ethiopia. Nobody's allowed to see it, they can't prove it, but it's guarded and protected, and they pass on from generation to generation the responsibility to be guardian of the Ark. And there is a priest that is responsible for maintaining the place where it's kept, but nobody's allowed to get in there or see it or anything like that. So
that would mean that the Babylonians didn't take the ark away, but did it go back with Bathsheba, or how did it get down into there? What is the story?
it wouldn't have gone back with Bathsheba. How it got there, I'd have to go back and research it. I don't know.
have no idea.
But it's as good a theory as any in terms of where it went. Unless it's in a warehouse in Washington, D.C. So let's see. Okay, now, the book of 1 Kings. The author of 1 Kings is unknown. It's traditionally Jeremiah. Now, this comes almost 400 years later. We went from 930 to 550 BC. This is, it's a retelling of the story from a slightly different perspective of the end of David's reign, but then especially of King Solomon. So we pick up here in the books of 1st and 2nd Kings the stories of the subsequent kings after David. First Kings, 1st and 2nd Samuel. 2nd Samuel is all about David. Then 1 Kings picks up at the end of David's life and the reign of Solomon, which is the peak of Israel's power and influence, the building of the temple. David wanted to build a temple for God. And God said, no, that's not for you to do. Your son will do it. But David made all the preparation, had designs done, gathered materials, but he was not the one to build the temple. And the reason was that God said, you're a man of war, and I want your son to be a man of peace, and I want him to build my temple. That's why the fact that Solomon gathered all those horses, which are assigned, only used for one thing, and that's war. There was no other, you didn't ride them for pleasure, you didn't ride them for transport. They were war animals. The fact that he did that was contrary to what God's intention for Solomon was. And since there were no major powers around, you notice he didn't conquer any other territory other than gaining economic control, because war was not God's intention for Solomon. And yet, he still acted like he was ready to fight whenever the opportunity came. So he built the temple, he built the king's palace, and then after his death, the kingdom gets divided. And we get that in the last 11 chapters. The first 11 chapters of the kingdom under Solomon. And at first Solomon was considered the wisest of all men, the wisdom of Solomon. When God said, what do you want? And for sort of as your coronation gift. And Solomon said, I want sufficient wisdom to rule my people well. And God said, because of that answer, I'm going to give you what you ask for, but I'm also going to give you long life and material wealth and all the other things that you empower and what you could have asked for. But then later on, the influence of women, you know, he got in trouble, went the wrong way, and did things that he was not supposed to do. So the first 11 chapters are the United Kingdom. I mean, we say united, it had not been divided at that point, but the kingdom under Solomon. And then chapters 12 to 22 is about the divided kingdom. Again, after Solomon's death, his son Rehoboam is challenged by Jeroboam, who is from the northern, you know, representing the northern tribes, if you will, and David being from Judah, the southern tribes. They end up saying, we don't want to go your way. And Rehoboam was very unwise. He had the counselors that his father had. He asked them, what should I do in order to, you know, be a good ruler and keep my... He said, have a soft hand, you know, be generous and welcoming to the people and serve them kindly. Well, he had a bunch of young friends, young Turks, and he asked them what he should do, and he said, and they said, you know, smack him around, show him who's boss. Well, he listened to his young friends, and as a result, got rebellion, and the kingdom was split in two.
So which one was that? Was it Jeroboam or?
Jeroboam was the challenger. Rehoboam was the son. Okay. Yeah.
No, they came to him because he was taxing them
Yes.
too heavily, and he said, "Well, my little finger is going to be like Solomon's elbow or whatever.
Right.
I'm going to tax you a lot heavier." He was taking all this money to build all these palaces for the women and all their temples and
Yep.
gather all the horses and so on. It's just fascinating to me that God used the abuse of His people as the excuse for them to leave.
Right.
We're not going to put up with this any longer. And he had an opportunity to say, "I'll be gentle," like you say. He said, "I'm the boss, and I'm going to make
show
it
you."
really tough."
Yep.
Yep.
Well, 1 Kings 9, God speaks to Solomon. The Lord said to him, Solomon, I have heard the prayer and plea you have made before me. I have consecrated this temple which you have built by putting my name there forever. My eyes and my heart will always be there, at least as long as the temple survived. And the presence of God left the temple in Jeremiah's time, when the Babylonians destroyed it. As for you, if you walk before me faithfully with integrity of heart and uprightness, as David your father did, and do all I command and observe my decrees and laws, I will establish your royal throne over Israel forever, as I promised David your father when I said, you shall never fail to have a successor on the throne of Israel. But if you or your descendants turn away from me and do not observe the commands and decrees I've given you, and go off to serve other gods and worship them, then I will cut off Israel from the land that I've given them, and will reject the temple I have consecrated for my name. So, the temple is divided in two, and let me jump ahead and show you what that looks like. I'm going to skip over 2 Kings, which is about what's going on. The kingdom of David, and Solomon was all this. This was originally a German map, so that's why it's got S-A-L, so S-O-L. When it split, you ended up with the break being just north of Jerusalem. The kingdom of Judah, which we spell with an H at the end, is here. The larger kingdom of Israel is in the north here. All of this area, they lost control of. All right? And that was the division. And it led to a lot of things. For instance, the people up in Israel, they set up their kingdom in Samaria, by the way, the city of Samaria, and that's why later they were referred to as the Samaritans. The city of Samaria was centrally located, and they set up two places to worship, because they couldn't get to the temple in Jerusalem anymore. These people were mad at each other. They couldn't get to the temple in Jerusalem, and so Jeroboam sets up two idols in two locations for them to worship. And from that point on, the northern kingdom of Israel never had a good king. They had different families. The southern kingdom of Judah had a few good kings, like Hezekiah and Josiah, but they had bad kings too. In between those two, Hezekiah's son Manasseh was one of the worst, and Manasseh's son Josiah then was one of the best. So the northern kingdom created their own way to worship, which was not according to God's will, in order to deal with no longer having access to Jerusalem. Yes, Marvin?
Yeah, well, he set up, like you say, his own calves, and he's hired new priests from other countries, and most of the Levites went south to
Right.
Judah because they were not welcome
Yep.
anymore there.
And we talk in terms of the southern kingdom being Judah and Benjamin, but there were pieces of other tribes, and the Levites, a lot of them fled the northern kingdom of Israel when Jeroboam instituted what they believed was false religion.
Yeah.
And in order to justify all that, they created their own version of the Tanakh. They added the 11th commandment, which we talked about. That the 11th commandment being that God has ordained that it's also okay to worship on Mount Gerizim, which is just outside Samaria. So then the stories of what happens during all of that is in the book of 2 Kings. We don't know who the author is, but like with 1 Kings, we believe it perhaps was Jeremiah, around 550 BC, a little bit similar time period. The story of the two divided kingdoms, and especially of the prophets Elijah and Elisha, leading up to the fall of the northern kingdom to Assyria and the southern kingdom to Babylon. And again, God used the kingdoms of Assyria and of Babylon, or empire really, to destroy those peoples who were unwilling to serve him or disobedient. First the northern kingdom. And again, all the kings of the southern kingdom were all descendants of David. So they kept it in the family in the south, and some of them were pretty good, some were awful. In the north, there were different families that took over. A lot of people were killed, a lot of kings were killed, people trying to take power. It was not a very nice situation. The purpose was to teach that unfaithfulness to God will lead to righteous discipline. So the first 16 chapters describes the divided kingdom. Chapter 17 is when God calls the Assyrians one of the most vicious militaries ever. I mean, if you go to the British Museum in London, you can see some of the relief carvings that they had brought back from Mesopotamia, from Assyria, etc. And there are these carvings of the Assyrians piling severed heads up outside the gate of a city that won't surrender, or of flaying victims alive, peeling their skin off while they're alive. Much of their victory was because of just terror. Everybody was scared to death of them. And then, that was in 722 BC. The southern kingdom of Judah survives, and they have, again, Sennacherib, the Assyrian king, comes down to Jerusalem to try to defeat them as well. Hezekiah the king is thinking about giving up, and that's when the prophet Isaiah says, don't, hold out, we'll be fine. And God sends a plague and kills a significant number of the Assyrians outside the wall of Jerusalem. Sennacherib goes back home. He eventually is assassinated by his sons, so they can take over. And the southern kingdom of Judah continues through the time from Hezekiah through the bad king, his son Manasseh, and then to his king Josiah. Under Josiah, they rediscover the law that had been lost. And he has it read. He makes a campaign of trying to destroy all of the places of false worship, all of the Baal altars, the Asherah poles, all of that stuff, and is a righteous king. But back in those days, they've lost their real power. They're no longer a major power, and so they end up having to side with one side or the other. And at that point, Babylon and Egypt, after Assyria has been displaced, Babylon and Egypt are fighting each other. And within Jerusalem, there's a group of people who want to support Egypt, and there's a group of people that want to support Babylon, and they keep going back and forth. Well, Josiah was in favor of supporting Babylon at this point. This is before they destroyed them. And so he goes out to battle an Egyptian army that is marching north to fight Babylon, and he's killed in battle. And so at that point, the Egyptians, are in control. Then the Babylonians come in. They drive the Egyptians back. They take control of Jerusalem. And again, at this point, they're not feeling very kindly toward them, because even though Josiah had been fighting for Babylon, the people who replaced him were not. And so for several years, they deported some of their leaders, and the young, well-to-do, smart, handsome this is where we get Daniel. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were taken by that's the Persians. No, it's taken into Babylon.
Babylon, yeah.
Just had a blank, I was thinking of Esther. Were taken to Babylon and were being raised to be like young rulers. And that there were a period of several years there when there was several times the Babylonian army would come back to try to put down a rebellion. And then finally, in 586 BC, they had enough, they destroyed the city, they destroyed the temple, carried all of the people off into captivity. They left a few people behind to work the fields, but that's about all. So this is something that happened over several years. And again, this is what the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom looked like. This is a different way of looking at it. The yellow line here, and you can see where the different tribes were. I'm sorry, the blue line here, incorporated, this is the northern kingdom, and you'll notice all the different colors up here. Because there were 10 tribes that were part of the northern kingdom, majority of the 10 tribes. And in the south, there really was Judah, and there was Benjamin, which is the brown. The green there, I think, represents Ephraim, which is Manasseh and Ephraim were the two half-tribes. I mean, they split Joseph's responsibilities, or his inheritance, rather. So the northern kingdom was these 10 tribes. The lost tribes of Israel are the way we have always described those, because the Assyrians, when they conquered a people, they would take the people off into captivity and spread them out over other parts of their empire. And then they would bring other people they'd conquered into this area, and they would force them to intermarry. And suppress their religion and everything else, because they thought that's the way to keep them from getting together and rebelling. That's why the Samaritans were considered, the people who ended up living there later, were considered half-breeds. They were half Hebrew and half something else. And they had this perverse kind of religion that they had developed during this divided kingdom. So the Jews and the Samaritans didn't get along because the Jews considered them impure. You know, they're not really pure Jews. The biology isn't right, and they had false aspects to the religion, and that's why the conflict. You have to understand that to understand the Samaritan woman at the well that Jesus stops to speak to, and the story of the Good Samaritan and all of that stuff. So the southern kingdom lasted considerably longer, about another 130 some years, 140 years. So, and there were only 2 tribes there. So these 10 tribes that were carried off into captivity became the lost tribes. I think most of you have heard me talking already about the fact that one of the clients I have right now, Jewish Voice, they're identifying, and not just them, but they're one of the organizations that are identifying the Jewish groups in various places around the world that have been claiming for, many of them for centuries, that they were descendants of Jews, and nobody believed them, even though they have a language similar to Hebrew and Hebrew names, and they follow Jewish law. Well, now that we have genetic tests, they've been able to prove that there are people, several tribes in Ethiopia, in Zimbabwe, perhaps in Nigeria, they're just working on that, and in India, and probably other places as well, that truly are, because they biologically can prove it now, truly are descended from the lost tribes of Israel. And so it's fascinating. In fact, I mentioned that the Igbo tribes in Nigeria, who claim to be descendants of Manasseh, if they really are Jewish, and if they prove that, and they haven't yet, there are like 50 million Igbo. All of a sudden, there are only 14 million Jews recognized in the world today. A little over half of them live in Israel and half elsewhere. If they all of a sudden have added 50 million Jews, people descended from Jewish roots, they quadrupled the number of Jews in the world, or quintupled the number of Jews in the world.
That should tick off Hitler.
Well, it also creates a problem for the nation of Israel, because they have a legal policy of Aliyah, which means that anybody who can prove they're Jewish has a right to come back to Israel. So, anyway.
Are they recognizing DNA now?
What's that?
Israel, are they recognizing the DNA?
In many cases, yes. In fact, it's been some of the Orthodox priests in Israel that have been most active in this. For instance, they've had 2 airlifts, one in the 80s and one in the 90s, from Falasha Jews in Ethiopia. I mentioned there's been Jewish presence there for a long time, but they've been able to genetically demonstrate that they are Jewish, and so they had airlifts bringing them back in the 80s and 90s. They've stopped now, because there's still quite a few more. And unfortunately, some of the Ethiopian Jews had left their home areas and had gone to where they thought they were going to be transported from. And then Israel stopped the transports, and particularly they refused to accept any of the Ethiopian Jews who had converted to Christianity. There are quite a few of those Messianic Ethiopian Jews, and Israel won't take them. So they ended up they left their homes, they left their property, and they're kind of almost refugees now with no place else to go. And so Jewish Voice, the organization I work with, and some others are working to try to help them.
So it isn't going only to the DNA, they're making all these other...
Well, the DNA is the starting point. I mean, they have to be able to prove it in some way, and they used to have a very complicated process to try to determine, are these people really Jewish? Now they can do it with genetic tests. But again, Israel, the officials in Israel are not being as proactive on that as they were 20 years ago, for the very simple reason that there's a danger they could be overwhelmed. So they're not real anxious to figure out where they're going to put 5 times as many people in the country of Israel. So people have different ideas about that.
So is it, did you say Ethiopia where these people are just stranded?
Well, there's some of them. There's at least 3 different groups in Ethiopia that have been proven to be Jewish. The Beit Abraham, the Beit Israel, which means the house of, and there's a third one, I can't remember the name right now. And they live in different areas, all of them fairly remote. And some of them from the Beit Abraham had relocated in order to be prepared to experience Aliyah, and then they were rejected. So they're kind of stuck now. They can't go back to where they were because people have taken over that land. So there we have it. Okay, let's look at a passage from 2 Kings 17. This is about the Assyrian conquest. The king of Assyria, this is Sennacherib. By the way, the Assyrians had cool names. I think my favorite name in that period is Tiglath-Pileser III.
I know, it sounded crazy.
Okay, the king of Assyria invaded the entire land, marched against Samaria, and laid siege to it for 3 years. Remember, that's the capital of the northern kingdom. In the 9th year of Hoshea, king of Assyria captured Samaria and deported the Israelites to Assyria. He settled them in Halah, in Gozan, on the Habor River, and in the towns of the Medes. So this is spreading out into Asia. All this took place because the Israelites had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them up out of Egypt from under the power of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. They worshipped other gods and followed the practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before them, as well as the practices that the kings of Israel had introduced. Remember, they set up places for them to worship idols. The Israelites secretly did things against the Lord their God that were not right. From watchtower to fortified city, they built themselves high places in all their towns. High place is a place of worship of pagan gods. They set up sacred stones and Asherah poles on every high hill and under every spreading tree. At every high place they burned incense, as the nations whom the Lord had driven out before them had done. They did wicked things that provoked the Lord to anger. They worshipped idols, though the Lord had said, "You shall not do this." The Lord warned Israel and Judah, that's the 2 kingdoms, northern kingdom of Israel, southern kingdom of Judah, through all his prophets and seers. "Turn from your evil ways, observe my commands and decrees, in accordance with the entire law that I commanded your fathers to obey, and that I delivered to you through my servants, the prophets." And then chapter 25. On the 7th day of the 5th month, in the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, Nebuzaradan, the commander of the imperial guard, an official of the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem. He set fire to the temple of the Lord, the royal palace, and all the houses of Jerusalem. Every important building he burned down. The whole Babylonian army under the commander of the imperial guard broke down the walls around Jerusalem. Nebuzaradan, the commander of the guard, carried into exile the people who remained in the city, along with the rest of the populace and those who had gone over to the king of Babylon. But the commander left behind some of the poorest people of the land to work the vineyards and fields. So Judah went into captivity away from her land. So this is the destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel by the Assyrians in 522 BC. And 722, sorry, 722. And then this is the destruction of Jerusalem and the southern kingdom of Judah by the Babylonians in 586. Okay? That's the destruction of the two, and it was no more. But fortunately, Babylon only existed for 56 years or so after this. before they were defeated by the Persians under Cyrus the Great. And Cyrus had a very different idea than what previous conquerors had had, and that is the best way to keep people from rebelling is to be nice to them. Let them run their own affairs, let them go back to the land they came from if they want, let them practice their own religion, rather than try to force them to do what you want them to do. And so he issued a decree that the people of Judah, there weren't any of the Israelites available at that point, the northern Israelites at that point, so he told the people of Judah that you can go back to your homes. And they weren't real quick to do it. I mean, after 56 years, they've got jobs, they've got houses, their kids are speaking the local language, you know, they got them into a good school, everything is, you don't just pull up roots. But slowly, in several different groups, some of them did go back, and that is the story we find in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. That they went back, and first they worked to rebuild the temple, to begin to teach the law, and then Nehemiah comes along, and the problem was that even though they were rebuilding the temple, they still had raiders coming in, stealing stuff, and killing people. So he felt God calling him to go back and rebuild the wall, and he did so in a marvel of organization, the way he did it. It's a fascinating story, read Nehemiah. And so the Jews are again replanted in Jerusalem. The temple, although they say it's not much to behold, at that point the temple was, you know, they were comparing it to the original temple that they had, and they said this is pretty awful. It's like a barn.
Yeah.
And then later on, Herod, Herod the Great would come along, and for whatever else problems he had, and they were pretty serious, he was a great builder. He built cities, and he rebuilt the temple in quite glorious fashion. That's the second temple period. We're not there yet, though. So, any questions about these books, the former prophets? Again, they're about events that happened in history, but it's less concerned about history as we understand it and more concerned about telling God's faithfulness and fulfilling His promises and the unfaithfulness of the Jewish people. First in the period of the conquest, then the period of the judges, and then the period of the monarchy. Right? The united monarchy, and then the splitting into the two kingdoms. Any questions?
So if the people went in from the wilderness wanderings around 1400, we'll say, and the Israel was destroyed, we'll say 700. So, so they actually had control of the land, what, 700 years?
Mm-hmm.
Or 850 years, something
Right.
like that.
And 3 generations, I mean, after the conquering of the land, of course, and there was time to settle it, 40 years or so, you then had 3 generations of the united monarchy, Saul, David, and Solomon. Then the split monarchy, but between the entrance into the land and the destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel, you had about 700 years, and it was about 850 years or so to the destruction of the southern kingdom.
And they never again had control of their land until
1947.
1947.
Great. Thank you all very much. I appreciate it.